Hi, this is Charles Wiley from Columbia Theological Seminary, and I'm here today with Raj Nadella, who is the Samuel A. Cartledge Associate Professor of New Testament. And we're going to talk a little bit about the New Testament and the pandemic we're going through and how it might give some insight into our following Christ in these days. So how are you doing, Raj?
I'm doing well, Charles. All things considered, it's a busy time for most of us. Busy time because we moved courses online, and if we had anticipated this before, it should have been a different experience. But we had to do it on very short notice, and so that's been busy.
So, as you are a New Testament professional, someone whose vocation is reflecting on text and seeing how that informs Christian discipleship, what insights do you get from the New Testament on what we're going through right now?
Charles, I've been thinking about how people are sheltered in place, at home, most people anyway, but at the same time, most people are feeling out of place metaphorically.
Right.
Unsettled, if I might even use that word. I think this is sort of a paradoxical space to be in. I've also been thinking about how most people are in a familiar space at home, spending most of their time with the people they have known for a very, very long time, and yet constantly focused on this unknown virus, unfamiliar pandemic. I think this too is a paradoxical experience for many people. And one other thing that I'll highlight in terms of paradox is, I think it's fair to say that many people, the majority of the people, have more flexibility with their schedule currently. Not more free time, but at least more flexibility. And I think many people also have a little more time, and some people are actually posting on social media about how they are experiencing what they might describe as boredom on some level. And yet, at the same time, most people are also feeling restless. So I've been thinking about these paradoxes, and I want to call it the pandemic paradox.
Okay.
So that's what has been on my mind lately. But you had another question for me.
So how does that relate? What New Testament text do you see connecting to that paradox?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. I think this phenomenon of being in one's own home, one's own hometown, and in a familiar space, but at the same time, metaphorically feeling out of place, is not entirely new to early Christians. 1 Peter chapter 2 uses this Greek word paroikoi, which is often translated as strangers, paroikoi, which literally means being out of place, out of one's own home. It's often translated as aliens or strangers, more accurately, I should say.
Right.
The context in 1 Peter is very different. They were experiencing political alienation and so on. But the idea there is that these early Christians were living in their own homes, but their worldview and their experiences were very different from the experiences of some people out there. And so they were experiencing this out of home-ness, if I might just make up that word, out of space. They were having this out of space experience while being in their own homes. So there is that idea in the New Testament. Again, the context was very different at the time. I think what this paradoxical experience, paradoxical space allowed these early Christians to do was to was to reflect on who they were as community, more importantly, who they wanted to be as community going forward. It was a liminal experience for them.
Right.
Yeah, so I'll pause there and see if we have other questions.
But that's one of the things I think is so interesting right now is that the New Testament is so much about the church as a community. And that's been one of the most important themes in thinking about the church in the last few decades. And yet I haven't physically seen anyone from my church community in 5 or 6 weeks now. I'm other than my wife.
Right. That is true. That is very much true, Charles. And at the same time, even as we are physically removed from each other, we are actually more connected than before.
Right.
Right, because people are very active on social media. They are constantly sharing ideas with each other, talking about what is happening out there. So I think we are doing less community spatially, but doing much, much more community metaphorically and through social media. Again, I think you probably saw this already. People on social media have been talking about how they're getting a lot more Facebook friend requests than ever before. I certainly have. I have gotten friend requests from people that I have not connected with in a long, long time.
Right.
So again, I think there is this desire to do the church, and to do the community more than ever before. I think that's paradoxical too.
And do you, are you suggesting, or well, I'll just ask, how does this sense of alienation or being a stranger, which you were talking about in First Peter, do you see people in the church, Christians, feeling more alienated or more of a stranger within the culture, or am I overreading that?
Again, as I was saying, the context in First Peter was that community was feeling alienated from the rest of the culture.
Right.
But in this culture, in this context, I was using the Greek word paraikoi to talk about how we are in our own spaces, but feeling alienated from this reality.
Okay.
Trying to make sense of this pandemic, this virus, and the realities that have been brought into reality by this pandemic. How do we make sense of this new world, if I might call it that? So I feel a little unsettled, and while I'm at my home all the time.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, that whole sense of feeling unsettled, even in the familiar.
But again, as I was saying earlier, feeling unsettled is sort of a liminal space that allows us to be more intentionally thinking about who we want to be going forward.
Right.
What our values are.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's really helpful. Well, thank you so much, Raj. This has been really interesting, and I hope that the rest of your teaching goes well and that you and your family are well.
Thank you so much, Charles.
Have a good day.